Relative clauses and the relative pronoun continued. So last time we talked about relative clauses and relative pronouns, and we talked about what a clause is. A clause is a group of words which, like a sentence, have a subject and a verb. A phrase, for example, lacks subjects and verbs. It's just a clump of words which don't have those things. So a clause is very much like a sentence, but it is linked to other clauses to make a more complex kind of sentence, a compound sentence. So the relative clause begins usually with the relative pronoun. The relative pronoun is what links the two clauses together, and it does that, remember, by referring to something in the main clause. So for example, if you say, this is the phone which I like, which is referring to the phone. This is the queen whom I serve, whom is referring to the queen. So the relative pronoun is always going to have a referent. We learned that in Latin, the relative pronoun is usually referred to as qui, que, quod, because that is the masculine, feminine, and neuter form in the singular, qui, que, and quod. So what we're going to do now, since last time we only talked about the nominative and accusative forms, is we're going to fill in all the rest of the forms. And the first thing that means is that we are going to be looking at the whole paradigm for qui, que, quod. Now, since there are masculine, feminine, and neuter forms, both in the singular and in the plural, for each of the 5 cases, that means that there are 30 different forms that you have to learn. And so when you look at the paradigm, it can seem a bit daunting, if not overwhelming. So there are some tips and tricks to learning it which make it a lot easier. And so I'm going to go through them, and then at the end I'm going to talk about the 3 Blind Relative Pronouns song, which may help you, if you can stand to learn it, which may help you memorize the paradigm. Okay, so the first thing to note when you look at the whole paradigm is that the dative and the ablative forms, that's 3 dative plural forms and 3 ablative plural forms, are all the same. 6 forms are identical. And this is always true of datives and ablatives. In the plural, they're always the same in form. So the dative and ablative form across all 3 genders in the plural forms is quibus. So it's quibus, 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 quibus. So if you can remember that, then you've learned 6 forms right off the bat. Okay, so the next thing to think about when you're learning all the different forms is to think about the genitive singular forms and the dative singular forms. So the genitive singular forms are all the same across the genders. Cuius, cuius, cuius. C-U-I-U-S. In the dative singular forms, you just drop the U-S off. Cui, cui, cui. So if you can remember that the genitive singular is cuius, 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 and the dative singular is cui, 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 then you've got 6 more forms for a total of 12 out of 30. Okay. Now, if you can remember that the name of the relative pronoun, or what it's usually referred to as, is qui, que, quod, that's because the first 3 forms, the nominative singular forms, masculine, feminine, and neuter, are qui, que, quod. And if you are looking at the paradigm, which you'll find on page 151, 141 in the relative pronouns chapter, also in the back of the book, also in the written form of the lecture that I'm going to post along with this video in the materials section in a PDF. If you're looking at the paradigm, and you should be looking at the paradigm as you're learning it, you'll notice that right across from qui, que, quod in the plural column, masculine, feminine, and neuter, it's qui, que, que. So the plurals in the nominative case are very similar to the plurals in the singular, very similar to the singulars in the nominative case. So qui, que, quod in the singular nominative, qui, que, que in the plural nominative. The only difference is that the neuter quod in the singular is que in the plural. So qui, que, quod, qui, que, que, those are the nominatives, and that adds 6 more forms for a total of 18, I think. Okay. Then you can think about the neuter rule. Okay, so quad is the nominative neuter singular. Therefore, the accusative neuter singular must be the same. It must also be quad. Quad in the neuter nominative singular, therefore quad in the accusative nominative singular. In the accusative neuter singular, sorry. And the same thing is true in the plural. The nominative neuter plural is quae. The accusative neuter plural, therefore, must also be quae. So there's 2 more forms for a total of 20. The genitive plurals, I always find genitive plurals easier than almost anything else to memorize. And if you remember the endings for your first and second declension nouns at all, then it'll be fairly easy to remember the genitive plural forms of the relative pronoun, which are quorum, quarum, quorum. So that's 3 more forms. That's total of 23. And that means that there's only 7 forms that you have to learn apart from those, if you can memorize those. And those are not too hard, really. If you take a look at them, there are similarities to the nouns that we've learned that will help you remember them. Anyway, on top of that, there's the 3 Blind Relative Pronouns song, which goes to the tune of 3 Blind Mice. So I'll sing it to you here. That's the original song is 3 blind mice, 3 blind mice. See how they run, see how they run. And the tune is the same. So you start out with the singulars. You can do the singulars, and then you can do the plurals. And you'll notice that when you come to the end, the ablative forms are very quick. And what they do is they cycle back and start you again at the nominatives. So you can keep singing it through time after time after time until you learn them. And then you could switch the tune over to the plurals. I'll show you. So, qui, que, quad, qui, que, quad, cuius, 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 cui, 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 quem, quam, quad, quem, quam, quad, quo, qua, quo, qui, que, quad, qui, que, quad, cuius, 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 cui, 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 and so on. And you can do the same with the plurals, like this. Qui, que, que, qui, que, que, quorum, quarum, quorum, quorum, quarum, quorum, quibus, 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 quos, quas, que, quos, quas, que, quibus, 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 qui, que, qui, que, quorum, quarum, quorum, quorum, quarum, quorum, quibus, 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 and so on. Okay, so what remains is to talk about how to use dative, ablative, and genitive relative pronouns. Now you may remember that nominative relative pronouns and accusative relative pronouns are something that we've already taken a look at and briefly go over them again. Okay, so if I say, I see the queen who rules me. Then if I say, I see the queen who, then who is talking about the queen. So it's going to take the gender and the number. It's going to be feminine and it's going to be singular. Okay, now we have to look at the relative clause to see what the word who is doing there. So who sees me? Who is the subject of that? Who is doing this, the seeing? Who meaning the queen, right? So you're going to have to put it in the nominative. So qui, que, quad in the nominative singular, the feminine form is que, so that's the form that you're going to use. On the other hand, if you say, I see the queen whom I rule, or even if you skip saying whom, which is a kind of a fancy bit of grammar that most of us don't use when we talk anymore. I see the queen who sees me is nominative, but I see the queen who I see. What's the who doing there? I see who, right? I see who. I see the queen. So who is the direct object of the relative clause, so it's going to have to go into the accusative, and instead of que, you're going to use quam. Okay, so that's just a little review of the nominative and accusatives for the relative pronoun. Datives, you remember the general rule of thumb for a dative translation is 2 or 4. So the way you're going to do it is you're going to say, I see the queen to whom I gave an apple. If you see to whom or for whom like that, you're going to know that this is a dative relative pronoun. Both of those words together are going to be represented by one dative relative pronoun. So you're going to say, okay, I see the queen to whom. That's referring to the queen, right? So again, it's going to be feminine and it's going to be singular, but it's going to be dative. And since the dative singular pronoun is the same across all genders, the relative pronoun there you're going to use is kui. Then in the ablative, so in the ablative, as I say, it's fairly similar. Remember that the rule of thumb translation for ablative is by or with, right? So if you wanted to say, this is the sword with which I wounded him, the with which is referring to the sword. So gladius gladius sword is going to be masculine and it's going to be singular, but the fact that it says with which rather than to whom or something like that, with which tells you that that's going to be, those two words are representing one ablative relative pronoun. So it's going to be masculine, it's going to be singular, and it's going to be ablative. You look down in your singulars column and find the masculine version of the ablative is going to be quo. So you're going to use quo to represent that. The genitive is a little bit trickier. You'll remember that the sort of rule of thumb translation for the genitive is of, right? So if you said, and you can use it to mean that of whom or of which is sometimes represents the genitive or is a good translation of a genitive relative pronoun. So this is the land of which I told you. That's going to be feminine, singular, and it's going to be genitive because it says of which. This is the queen of whom I told you. So that would also be the genitive. In each case, it would be feminine singular, so it's going to be cuius. But the genitive relative pronoun is often translated as whose if it's personal rather than a which or that. So if you wanted to say, this is the queen whose maidservants I borrowed, then you would, it's the same as saying, this is the queen of whom I borrowed the maidservants. In other words, the maidservants were of maidservants of the queen. So whose is going to be of whom. So if it's of the queen, then you're going to use the feminine, you're going to use the singular, but you're going to use the genitive. So once again, it's going to be cuius. Okay, that's the relative pronoun continued lesson.